She didn't grow up in couture. She wasn't born into glossy pages or polished runways. Her world was stitched with simplicity, no silver spoons, no family legacy in the fashion world, and certainly no contacts who could open the right doors with a single call. Her earliest mirrors didn't reflect back the confidence of a future model, but rather the uncertainty of a girl who saw too many reasons not to try. From the start, she was told the world she dreamed of wasn't built for girls like her. She didn't have the look. She didn't have the walk. She didn't belong. And people made sure she knew it. The first time she set foot in an audition room, the air was stiff with judgment. Other girls towered with practiced smiles and industry polish, their resumes lined with campaigns and casting directors who knew their names. She stood in line wearing borrowed heels and secondhand hope. She didn't have a portfolio. She barely had confidence. When she walked, it was all instinct, no choreographer, no coach, just raw determination that somehow carried her down that tiny, taped-off runway. The casting agents didn't hide their disinterest. They didn't look twice. No feedback. No second chances. Just a clipboard marked with silence. Rejected. But that was only the first of many. Each rejection letter felt like a bruise, but also strangely like a stitch, painful, but piecing something together. They didn't say she needed more experience. They didn't say she needed training. They simply said she wasn't right. Not tall enough. Not angular enough. Not exotic enough. Not marketable. A body to this, a face to that. She wasn't the type. And in an industry obsessed with types, she became the one they looked past. She began to understand that rejection here wasn't just about beauty, it was about boundaries. Invisible lines drawn by gatekeepers who decided who deserved to be seen. She could have left. So many did. She watched girls with more credentials give up after fewer numbers. But somehow, the rejections didn't push her away. They pushed her in. Deeper. Harder. She began studying photographs, catwalks, poses, posture. She trained herself in silence. In front of mirrors, in hallways, even in parking lots after long shifts. Her practice became her defiance. She couldn't make them see her, not yet. But she could make sure that when they finally looked, they'd have no choice but to remember her. She started showing up at open castings others overlooked. She took unpaid gigs just for the experience. She walked in obscure student fashion shows where the lights were dim, but her presence lit up the floor. Some nights she went home with blistered feet and unpaid bills. Other nights she went home with the smallest spark of validation, a compliment, a nod, a promise to call. They didn't always follow through, but each moment of almost belief was fuel. Still, the industry remained indifferent. Rejection began to feel like ritual. One designer told her bluntly, "You're not the fantasy people pay to see." Another said, "There's nothing unique about your face." The words stung, but she wrote them down. Not to remember the pain, but to track every barrier she would eventually shatter. Even when her name was missing from every casting list, she kept a folder of printouts, her own headshots, hand-edited, hand-printed, handed out like seeds to anyone willing to take one. Most tossed them. A few didn't. Even among the few cracks in the wall, trust was rare. Some agents offered help, but only if she agreed to change. Straighten her hair. Lose more weight. Alter her look to fit the mold. But that was the one thing she wouldn't do. She was done editing herself to fit in. If fashion couldn't make room for her as she was, then she'd have to show them what they were missing. Her journey became a quiet rebellion. For every no, she sharpened her yes. For every door closed, she found a window. She stopped asking for permission and started demanding space. Not by shouting, not by breaking rules, but by becoming undeniable. She couldn't fake legacy. She couldn't buy opportunity. But she could become so good, so disciplined, so original, that ignoring her would eventually become impossible. Rejection didn't make her smaller. It carved her into something sharper. Something that didn't need approval to keep moving. Something that didn't fit into a casting category, but instead began rewriting it. She didn't have a blueprint, only a burning need to prove she belonged. In the silence that followed each rejection, she started to build something no agency could teach her, an unshakable mindset. When the world tells you over and over again that you aren't enough, you can either believe it or you can become something they can't measure. She chose the latter. Not because it was easier, but because it was the only option she had left. The underdog mindset doesn't ask for applause. It learns to survive without it. It doesn't wait for validation. It becomes its own. There were no cameras watching the early work. No press coverage, no interviews, no lights waiting to spotlight her progress. There was just her in worn-out shoes, standing in front of a cracked mirror, practicing poses until muscle memory took over. She studied angles late into the night, mimicking editorials from magazines she couldn't afford, often from pages torn out and pinned to her bedroom wall. Every night she became her own stylist, her own coach, her own believer. There was no one there to tell her she was doing it right. But she kept showing up anyway. When she walked the streets, she watched everything, the way confident people carried themselves, the shift in posture when someone entered a room and owned it. She noted what caught attention and what faded into background noise. She started to imitate power, not in a performative way, but as practice. Her shoulders rolled back more. Her chin lifted higher. Not arrogance, just defiance of the voices that still whispered she didn't belong. She began to train her mind like a muscle. Every rejection became data, not defeat. She learned to disconnect the word no from her sense of worth. If they didn't pick her, that was their limitation, not hers. She started writing down her goals, no matter how impossible they sounded. Not just walk in a show, but walk in Paris, land a cover, become the first. She didn't whisper them to herself. She said them out loud. To her own reflection. To the walls of her apartment. To the sky when no one else was listening. The underdog mindset isn't fueled by rage. It's fueled by clarity. She didn't want revenge. She wanted legacy. Not to silence her critics, but to amplify her existence so loudly they couldn't pretend they hadn't seen her coming. She didn't just want to succeed, she wanted to reframe what success looked like. She didn't just want to be in the room. She wanted to change who was allowed to enter it. There were moments when everything in her life screamed for her to quit. When bills piled up, when her body ached from back-to-back auditions, when even hope felt like a burden. But that's when the mindset kicked in. When she reminded herself why she started. She remembered the little girl who first dreamed of fashion while flipping through worn-out magazines, not understanding the words, but hypnotized by the images. That little girl had no armor, no allies, no guarantees. Just the hope that maybe, just maybe, there was space in this world for someone like her. She began to treat every small opportunity like it was a breakthrough. A free gig? She gave it the energy of a Vogue cover. A student designer show in a basement? She walked it like it was Paris Fashion Week. She became known not for her status, but for her presence. She wasn't the biggest name, but she was the hardest to forget. She refused to phone it in, even when no one was watching. That was the rule she lived by. Show up like the world is already paying attention, even if it isn't. People started to notice, not just her beauty, but her intensity. The way she listened. The way she learned. She asked questions. She offered help. She showed gratitude. But she never begged. She had seen what desperation looked like, and she had risen above it. She had transformed rejection into training. Silence into strategy. Doubt into discipline. And while the spotlight hadn't hit her yet, her light was already undeniable to those who looked closely enough. This mindset didn't promise her instant success. It didn't make the fashion world kinder. But it made her unbreakable. When you stop asking for permission to dream, the world can no longer hold the keys to your future. She wasn't trying to be the next anyone. She was building something entirely her own. She wasn't interested in shortcuts or secrets. Her only strategy was consistency, her only weapon was truth, and her only competition was the version of herself that gave up too soon. She didn't look like the girls on the billboards. Not the ones framed in icy perfection, or the ones who floated down runways like porcelain dolls. Her beauty didn't whisper, it challenged. It didn't apologize. It didn't bend to expectation. And in an industry obsessed with symmetry, silence, and sameness, she was loud in all the ways they hadn't prepared for. Her skin, her shape, her presence, they told a different story. One the fashion world hadn't scripted. One it wasn't ready for. In casting rooms, she could feel it in the way they looked at her. Not unkind, just uncertain. Like they were trying to categorize her and couldn't quite find the right label. She didn't fit their mood board. She wasn't the inspiration behind their collection. She was the interruption to their carefully curated aesthetic. When she walked in, conversations paused. Eyes scanned, hesitated, moved on. It wasn't always overt, but it was there, in the lack of eye contact, in the polite disinterest, in the way they thanked her and moved to the next girl with quicker enthusiasm. But she knew something they didn't. She knew she wasn't the problem. The system was. A system that worshipped one kind of beauty, one kind of body, one kind of woman. And she had no interest in becoming their idea of enough. Instead, she decided she would expand the definition of beauty until it made room for her. Until it made room for girls who looked like her, walked like her, came from where she came from. She wasn't asking for inclusion. She was building it, one fearless step at a time. She started experimenting with the very things they told her to hide. Her natural hair became a crown. Her full features became a signature. She stopped trying to mimic what she saw in magazines and began presenting herself exactly as she was, authentic, unfiltered, unafraid. She didn't need to shrink herself to fit in. She needed to stand taller in her truth. The very things they once called too much or too different began to turn heads in new ways. Not because they changed, but because she stopped apologizing for them. Photographers began to notice. A few brave enough to see outside the box started inviting her in. They shot her in ways that honored her rather than erased her. They captured her angles, her expressions, her contradictions. She wasn't just a canvas, they let her be a collaborator. She brought ideas, posed differently, dared to move outside the frame. Slowly, shoots that were once transactional became transformative. She wasn't just modeling clothes. She was modeling freedom. But still, the industry hesitated. Editors were cautious. Brands stayed quiet. She heard the word niche more than once, as if her presence was a trend to be tested, not a truth to be embraced. But she kept going. She kept showing up. With every step, she carried not just her own fight, but the weight of others who had been told they weren't the right kind of beautiful. Her existence became proof. Her photos became protest. Her walk became a statement. She refused to dim her power to match someone else's comfort. If the runway wasn't ready for her, then it needed to catch up. She wasn't there to be a token. She wasn't there to be celebrated once and forgotten the next season. She was there to stay, to shift, to shake the foundation. She spoke up in meetings. She questioned styling choices that didn't feel honest. She challenged photographers who tried to change her too much. She walked into boardrooms not with arrogance, but with unshakable awareness that she deserved to be there. As her presence grew, so did her influence. Young girls began messaging her. Mothers began thanking her. Her image, once rejected for being too different, now hung in stores, appeared in ads, showed up on mood boards that once wouldn't have included her. And still, she stayed grounded. Not because she doubted her power, but because she understood the responsibility that came with being the first of anything. She wasn't just modeling anymore. She was leading. She had become what she never saw growing up, a mirror. Not a distorted one, not a filtered one, but a real one. The kind that reflects back truth. The kind that changes lives quietly, fiercely, unapologetically. The kind that shows a new generation they don't need to change to be seen. They only need to show up, fully, completely, in all the ways the world once said were wrong. Because beauty isn't what they say it is. It's what you decide it becomes. When the journey felt impossible, it wasn't talent that kept her moving, it was the strange, invisible string of moments that didn't make sense until later. The accidental meetings. The random kindness of strangers. The closed doors that somehow led to better ones. Her rise wasn't just a result of ambition. It was stitched together by mentors, missteps, and miracles. And though the world often credits success to strategy, she knew hers was also built on something messier, softer, harder to define. Faith in the unpredictable. Trust in timing. Openness to people who saw something in her before she could see it in herself. Her first mentor didn't come from a runway or fashion house. It was a makeup artist on a low-budget photo shoot. The kind where the lights were hot, the clothes didn't fit, and the photographer was still figuring out how to use the camera. But in the middle of all that chaos, this woman saw her. Not just her face, but her fire. She gave her tips, told her how to stand, how to breathe in front of the lens. She didn't sugarcoat anything. She told her which angles worked, what didn't, and where she needed to grow. It wasn't glamorous, but it was the first time someone in the industry treated her like she mattered. That moment didn't launch her career, but it anchored her belief. There were others, stylists, who gave her leftover clothes after a shoot so she could have something to wear to auditions, casting assistants who whispered which direction to turn so she wouldn't get overlooked, fellow models who shared agency contacts scribbled on napkins. None of them owed her anything. But their small acts of grace added up. They became stepping stones across a river she didn't know how to cross on her own. Some people arrived for a single conversation. Others stayed for years. But each left something behind, a lesson, a connection, reminder that she wasn't doing this alone. The missteps came, too. The contracts she signed without reading. The fake opportunities that were really just exploitation in disguise. The photo shoots that pushed her past comfort and made her question her boundaries. The agent who promised the world, took her money, and vanished. Each mistake hurt, but also hardened her in the right places. She started learning how to say no, how to walk away, how to trust her instincts when something didn't feel right. Failure didn't weaken her. It gave her better questions to ask. There was a moment, just one, that almost ended everything. A job she thought would finally launch her, a campaign she'd dreamed of for years. She got the call back, the fitting, the contract. Everything seemed perfect. Then, last minute, she was replaced. No explanation. Just a polite thank you and a message that someone else had been selected. She didn't get out of bed for 2 days. It felt personal, even though it wasn't. But then, something strange happened. The rejection that shattered her led her to a new photographer. One who'd seen her test shoot from months ago and invited her to work on a small editorial. That shoot ended up going viral. It wasn't the job she wanted, but it became the moment that changed everything. The miracles weren't always big. Sometimes they were just about being in the right room at the right time. A stylist who needed a last-minute replacement. A brand rep who was tired of seeing the same faces. A designer who was looking for someone who didn't fit the mold. She realized that when preparation meets chance, magic happens. But only if you're there. Only if you've done the work. Only if you've stayed ready through the silence, the losses, the near misses. She didn't forget the ones who lifted her. She carried them with her in her posture, in her gratitude, in the way she started lifting others when she got the chance. She became a mentor without meaning to. Young models started asking her how she got her start. She told them the truth, not just about the contracts and auditions, but about the heartbreak, the hustle, and the strange, beautiful way the universe sometimes rearranges itself for the girl who refuses to quit. She told them not to wait for permission. To show up, even when no one's watching. To prepare, even when it looks like nothing is happening. Because someone, somewhere, might be watching. And that moment might be the beginning of everything they've been waiting for. She didn't just rise by walking runways, she rose by walking into rooms no one expected her to be in. Fashion wasn't just about fabric for her. It was about voice. And once she realized that the world was finally listening, she refused to stay silent. She wasn't content with being the face of a campaign. She wanted to question the campaign's purpose. She didn't want to just wear the clothes. She wanted to ask who made them, how they were made, and why the same faces were being seen season after season. Visibility wasn't enough. She wanted impact. The industry had always thrived on silence. The beautiful images, the untouched perfection, the curated mystery. But behind all that shimmer, she had seen too many shadows. The unfair contracts, the erased identities, the quiet racism, the unspoken pressure to conform. She had felt the sting of being the diversity pick in a room full of sameness. She had been told more than once to tone it down, to look more commercial, to keep it easy. But she didn't come this far just to blend in. She had something to say, and now that the microphone was in her hand, even briefly, she wasn't giving it back. She began speaking up during fittings, questioning why there were no stylists familiar with her hair texture. She brought up how rarely she saw models like herself in luxury campaigns without being typecast into a message. She asked designers why plus-size samples were still considered an inconvenience instead of a priority. And slowly, her questions started getting answered, not always comfortably, not always immediately, but they made people look up. They made people think. They made some people very uncomfortable. It would have been easier to stay quiet, to smile, pose, collect the check, and move on. But that would have meant turning her back on the version of herself who fought to get here. The younger version who stared at screens, wondering why she never saw her skin tone, her body, her story reflected back. If she stayed quiet now, what was the point of surviving all the rejection in the first place? So she became intentional with her platform. When she posted, she didn't just post beauty, she posted truth. She used captions to tell the real stories behind the shoots. The long hours. The last-minute cancellations. The times her name was forgotten or mispronounced or listed last. She didn't do it for sympathy. She did it so others would know they weren't alone. She didn't want the next girl to feel as isolated as she once did. She began aligning herself with brands that aligned with her. She turned down offers that didn't feel right, even when the paycheck was tempting. She understood her name had power now, and she refused to use it to prop up systems that still excluded others. She collaborated with emerging designers who had something radical to say. She lent her visibility to causes that fought for labor rights, mental health, and authentic inclusion in fashion, not the kind you put on a billboard, but the kind you build behind the scenes. Not everyone applauded her. Some whispered that she was difficult, that she asked too many questions, that she was biting the hand that fed her. But she had already survived without their approval once. She could do it again. The goal was never to be palatable. The goal was to be real. If her presence made people shift in their seats, maybe that discomfort was the first step toward change. She began mentoring in ways that didn't require attention. Quiet meetings with new faces who reminded her of herself. Late-night messages of encouragement. Helping them navigate castings, teaching them how to read contracts, reminding them of their worth when the world tried to shrink it. She taught them not just how to walk, but how to stand, how to own their space, how to recognize that their voice mattered even when it trembled. Her advocacy wasn't perfect. It wasn't polished. It was messy and evolving and sometimes misunderstood. But it was honest. And it was rooted in something deeper than image. She didn't want to be just a moment in fashion. She wanted to shift its memory. To leave behind not just a legacy of beautiful pictures, but of open doors, louder voices, rewritten standards. She knew change wouldn't come quickly. But she also knew it never came from silence. And that sometimes, the boldest thing a woman can do, especially one who is never supposed to succeed, is to speak anyway. She had been in the spotlight, yes, but the real work had always happened in the shadows. Behind the perfect photos, the polished runways, the awards, and the headlines, there was a different kind of story. One of exhaustion that doesn't photograph well. Of hotel rooms that feel like cages. Of success that tastes bittersweet when you're too tired to feel it. The truth was, even after she made it, the world never stopped asking her to prove she deserved it. Every campaign, every shoot, every interview carried with it an unspoken pressure. Do it better than before, or they'll forget you were ever here. She learned that success doesn't silence doubt, it just changes its accent. In the beginning, people doubted whether she could belong. Later, they doubted whether she could stay. And in between those doubts, she had to carry her own. Was she good enough to last? Was she still herself, or just who the world wanted her to be? Could she protect the girl who once dreamed of this without turning her into someone jaded and hollow? The mental toll was heavier than the physical one. The early call times, the relentless travel, the pressure to look flawless in every frame, those were hard. But they were predictable. What caught her off guard was the loneliness. The echo of unfamiliar cities. The conversations that never went past surface level. The applause that faded too quickly. She had built her identity around breaking into this world, and once she was in, she found herself wondering what else she was supposed to be. She began to realize that the version of success she had once idolized didn't include peace. It didn't include balance. It didn't include self. And so, quietly, without ceremony, she started to redefine it. She stopped saying yes to everything. She took days off without guilt. She began therapy. Not because she was falling apart, but because she didn't want to wait until she was. She wanted to understand how to hold her own story with care, not just perform it for others. There were people who didn't understand, who called her distant or difficult or too protective of her time. But she had learned the hard way that burnout doesn't arrive loudly. It creeps in, disguised as ambition. It looks like success until it feels like suffocation. She chose to protect herself before she had nothing left to give. In the quiet, she reconnected with the parts of her she'd left behind. The hobbies that had nothing to do with fashion. The family who still saw her as a daughter, a sister, not a star. The friends who weren't impressed by magazine covers, but who remembered the days she'd cried over casting rejections. They reminded her of the foundation underneath the spotlight. The truth beneath the image. The human beneath the icon. She also began to reflect on how much the journey had cost her. The birthdays missed. The relationships that didn't survive the pace. The moments she'd watched pass by from inside a car on the way to another fitting. She didn't regret it, but she acknowledged it. She stopped pretending that achievement was without sacrifice. She allowed herself to grieve the versions of her life that could have been, and to celebrate the one she had built anyway. That self-awareness became her power. She stopped seeking validation in press or praise. She started using her platform not just to amplify fashion, but to advocate for mental wellness within it. She began talking about the quiet struggles no one photographed. The panic attacks backstage. The imposter syndrome before big shows. The crushing silence after a campaign ends. She wasn't trying to be brave. She was just trying to be honest. She discovered that vulnerability didn't make her weaker, it made her more real. And in that realness, others began to open up. Models who had once admired her from afar began to confide in her. Industry insiders began to rethink their silence. Her truth created space for other truths. And slowly, the world she had once fought so hard to enter began to shift. Not because she demanded it, but because she showed that success, at its most meaningful, includes healing. She wasn't chasing legacy anymore. She was living it. Not through the glossy accolades, but through the quiet moments where she chose herself. The ones where she didn't perform strength, but embodied it in softness. The ones where she proved, not to the world, but to herself, that making fashion history was never just about being seen. It was about surviving the price of visibility and choosing to stay whole anyway.